The night air was thick with an eerie calm, a stillness that seemed almost unnatural across the northern and central Philippines. Far out over the restless Philippine Sea, a dark mass gathered, a brewing storm unlike any the region had seen in years. The satellite images flashed ominously on screens in meteorological offices, showing a rapidly intensifying tropical depression, a threat that would soon be known by a name etched in the memories of millions: Chrysing. What began as a whisper of wind and scattered rain swiftly grew into a roaring tempest, fueled by the warming waters of the sea and shifting atmospheric patterns. The clock ticked closer to midnight when the storm finally made landfall. It struck with a violent fury. Torrential rains hammered down relentlessly as howling winds bent trees and tore at rooftops. In the provinces of Kagan, Isabela, and Aurora, the first warnings of catastrophe began to sound. Communities that had long known the rhythm of seasonal storms found themselves facing something far more brutal, far more unforgiving. Floodwaters rose with alarming speed, swallowing streets and homes in a growing tide of destruction. Landslides triggered by the saturated earth thundered down hillsides, burying houses and cutting off vital roads. The power grid flickered and died, plunging entire municipalities into darkness and isolation. Amidst the chaos, families scrambled for safety. Mothers lifted children above waist-deep water. Fishermen clung to debris as waves tossed their boats like toys. The National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council reported that over 142,000 people were forced to evacuate, seeking refuge in hastily set-up emergency shelters. But even in these safe havens, the terror was far from over. The storm's wrath was relentless. In Bangi, Kalalala, floodwaters rose to chest level within mere hours. Helicopters buzzed overhead, their spotlights cutting through the murk as Coast Guard personnel launched desperate rescue missions. The roar of the storm was punctuated by cries for help, the hum of motors from inflatable boats, and the unyielding pulse of nature's fury. Damage assessments soon painted a grim picture. Over 562 million Cuban pesos, approximately $9.6 million in infrastructure losses. Roads crumbled, power lines snapped, and communication towers toppled, cutting off lines of contact just when coordination was most crucial. Ports closed, leaving dozens of vessels and hundreds of passengers stranded as treacherous seas churned. Yet as the storm began to wane, a new danger emerged on the horizon. A low-pressure area west of Baban quickly developed into tropical depression among, threatening to compound the devastation already wreaked by Chrysing. Meteorologists sounded urgent warnings. This was no time for respite. The government moved swiftly, declaring states of emergency in 29 cities and municipalities, unleashing a coordinated mobilization of resources. Food, medical supplies, and temporary shelters were dispatched, even as relief workers battled mudslides and flooded roads to reach those in need. President Maria Leonor Santiago addressed the nation with a voice steady but filled with resolve, promising that the country would rebuild, recover, and stand united. But the question hung heavy in the air. How many more storms would come? How many more communities would be swallowed by floods? The answer lay not just in weather reports, but in a changing climate, a reality the Philippines had come to face with grim acceptance. Tonight, as floodwaters continue their silent advance, the people brace themselves for whatever comes next. Their resilience will be tested, their stories written in mud and rain. This is not just a storm. It is a turning point, and the world watches as the Philippines confronts the wrath of nature like never before. As dawn broke over the battered landscapes of northern and central Philippines, the full scale of the devastation began to emerge from the shadows of night. Rivers that once carried life now churned as destructive forces, spilling over banks with a rage that swallowed roads, homes, and fields in murky torrents. The relentless downpour had turned familiar villages into islands surrounded by endless water, isolating tens of thousands and making rescue efforts a race against time. In provinces like Kagan and Aurora, the earth itself seemed to rebel. Saturated from days of heavy rain, hillsides gave way in sudden landslides that thundered through communities without warning. Entire homes were buried under crushing mud, their inhabitants trapped in a cold, suffocating grave. Rescue teams, armed with heavy machinery and sheer determination, dug tirelessly to reach those still alive beneath the debris, their efforts shadowed by the haunting uncertainty of what lay beneath. Meanwhile, in the floodplains, families clung to anything that could keep them afloat: roofs, tree branches, makeshift rafts. The floodwaters crept relentlessly inside homes, sweeping away possessions and memories with merciless efficiency. The cries of children and the desperate calls for help echoed across the submerged streets, carried by the howling wind and the relentless storm. The government's response was swift but overwhelmed. Emergency shelters filled rapidly as evacuation orders expanded, stretching resources thin. Medical teams worked around the clock, treating hypothermia, injuries, and waterborne diseases that spread swiftly through the cramped shelters. Communication remained a challenge. Downed power lines and toppled cell towers rendered many communities unreachable by phone or internet, forcing relief workers to rely on boats, helicopters, and sometimes even drones to assess the situation. At the heart of the chaos, Coast Guard units executed daring rescues, navigating flooded neighborhoods and swollen rivers. Stories of survival emerged from the floodwaters, like that of 38-year-old fisherman Raona de la Cruz, who clung to a piece of floating wood for hours before a rescue team pulled him from the grasp of the storm. His voice trembled as he recounted the ordeal, a stark reminder of the human cost behind the statistics. The looming presence of tropical depression Solomon added to the mounting tension. Meteorologists warned that its path could intersect with areas still reeling from Crising's destruction, potentially unleashing another wave of rainfall and wind that could undo the fragile progress of rescue and recovery. Officials scrambled to prepare, issuing evacuation orders and reinforcing shelters even as they continued to search for survivors from the first storm. Beyond the immediate crisis, experts pointed to a deeper, more troubling reality. The increasing frequency and intensity of such storms is no accident. Climate change, they said, is turning once rare disasters into the new normal. Rising sea temperatures, shifting wind patterns, and unpredictable weather systems are fueling a dangerous cycle of destruction that communities like those in the Philippines must learn to endure and adapt to. In the midst of tragedy, resilience shone through. Volunteers from local and international organizations poured in, bringing food, water, medical supplies, and hope. The Philippine Red Cross, UNICEF, and the World Food Programme mobilized rapidly, their teams working tirelessly to provide aid and comfort to those who had lost everything. And despite the exhaustion and heartbreak, communities banded together, neighbors helping neighbors, strangers risking their lives for others. As the rain clouds gathered once again on the horizon, the question remained: how much more can they endure? The answers would come not just from the storms themselves, but from the courage, strength, and spirit of a nation facing the fury of nature head-on. The sun had barely risen when the skies darkened once more, as if warning that the nightmare was far from over. Tropical depression among had strengthened, its swirling clouds gathering ominously over the western coasts of Luzon. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Residents braced for yet another round of torrential rains and howling winds that threatened to compound the destruction already wrought by Crising. In the battered towns along the coast, every drop of rain was met with anxiety. Streets that had barely begun to dry were quickly swallowed again by rising floodwaters, twisting rivers into unstoppable torrents. Bridges weakened by the earlier storms creaked under the weight of swollen waters, sparking fears of collapse that would sever vital links between isolated communities and emergency responders. Evacuations expanded rapidly as government agencies worked feverishly to move families to safer ground. The air was filled with the low hum of helicopters ferrying people away from flooded areas, their rotors chopping through the heavy rain like a beacon of hope in the chaos. But for many, time was running out. The storm's relentless advance threatened to cut off escape routes and leave entire populations trapped in a watery prison. In towns like Zambales and Pangasinan, the scale of devastation grew clearer with each passing hour. Entire neighborhoods stood submerged, their rooftops barely visible above the murky floodwaters. Emergency shelters overflowed, forcing many to seek refuge in schools, churches, and makeshift tents. Amid the turmoil, medical teams battled not just injuries, but the looming threat of disease outbreaks. Cholera, leptospirosis, and dengue fever, lurking in the stagnant waters and overcrowded shelters. Power outages plunged vast regions into darkness, cutting off communication and complicating rescue efforts. In some areas, families huddled in silence, listening to the pounding rain and the distant roar of landslides, uncertain whether their homes would withstand the storm's fury. The desperation was palpable. Children clung tightly to parents, and elders prayed for deliverance. Meanwhile, the Philippine Coast Guard intensified patrols along the coastline, warning fishermen and residents of dangerous sea conditions. The waves, whipped into fury by amongst winds, crashed against shorelines with unprecedented force, threatening to tear away everything in their path. Ports remained closed, leaving thousands stranded and supplies delayed. International aid agencies sent reinforcements, their teams arriving with fresh supplies and specialized equipment for flood rescue and medical relief. Yet, even as assistance poured in, the human stories behind the headlines unfolded, stories of loss, survival, and resilience that underscored the staggering scale of the disaster. One such story came from the coastal barangay of San Andres, where the waters had swallowed the community almost overnight. Residents described how the flood surged with terrifying speed, leaving little time to gather belongings or seek higher ground. Elderly couple Jose and Maria Santos were rescued by neighbors after spending hours clinging to the rafters of their home. Their tearful gratitude was a stark reminder of the fragile line between life and death. As the storm slowly moved inland, it unleashed fierce winds that toppled trees and power lines, sending debris hurtling through the air. Schools and public buildings bore the brunt, with windows shattered and roofs torn away. Yet, even amid the wreckage, community volunteers mobilized, clearing roads and assisting the elderly and disabled in evacuation efforts. Meteorologists warned that the region was far from safe. The saturated soil and swollen rivers meant that any additional rainfall could trigger new landslides and flooding. Authorities issued urgent warnings for residents to stay vigilant, heed evacuation orders, and prepare for the worst. Behind the scenes, government officials and disaster response teams worked round the clock, coordinating efforts to distribute food, water, and medical supplies to the most affected areas. Mobile clinics were dispatched to treat injuries and prevent disease, while engineers assessed the structural integrity of bridges and roads vital for relief operations. The impact of these successive storms extended beyond immediate destruction. Schools remained closed indefinitely, businesses shuttered, and the economy took a heavy hit as agricultural lands were ravaged. The emotional toll on survivors was immense, with trauma and uncertainty casting long shadows over communities struggling to rebuild. Experts pointed to a grim future if climate trends continued unabated. Dr. Elena Ramos, a leading climate scientist, emphasized that the frequency and severity of tropical storms in the Philippines were directly linked to global warming. Rising ocean temperatures provide the fuel for these storms, making them more intense and unpredictable. "We are witnessing a new reality," she said. "Adaptation and resilience are no longer optional, they are imperative." Despite the overwhelming challenges, the Filipino spirit remained unbroken. Local organizations, volunteers, and neighbors banded together in solidarity, offering shelter, food, and comfort. Stories of heroism and kindness became beacons of hope amid the devastation, a testament to the resilience that defines this island nation. As night fell and the rain finally began to ease, many knew that the road to recovery would be long and arduous. But amidst the ruins, the will to rebuild burned brightly, a powerful reminder that even in the face of nature's wrath, hope endures.